My daughter looked me in the eye across the dinner table I'd built with my own hands and told me I was a burden on her fancily. I smiled, set down my fork, and said goodnight. 3 weeks later, she opened a certified letter at her kitchen counter. It was a notice of sale. The house she'd been living in for 4 years, the one I'd paid $2.8 million for in cash, had just been sold to a commercial developer. She had 30 days to vacate. Let me back up. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years building a commercial roofing company out of nothing. Not a loan from my father, not a business school education, nothing but a pickup truck, a used ladder, and a stubbornness that my late wife, Carolyn, used to call my best and worst quality simultaneously. By the time I sold the business in 2019, we had 42 employees and contracts across the southeastern United States. I wasn't wealthy in the way people imagine when they hear the word. I didn't own a yacht. I drove the same Ford F-150 for 11 years. But I had built something real, and it was mine in a way that very few things in life ever truly are. Carolyn died 18 months before I sold the business. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by November. 8 months. I've never told anyone how fast those 8 months went, how every morning I woke up and for a split second the world was normal, and then the weight of it landed on me all over again. After she was gone, the business felt hollow. The contracts, the bids, the payroll, all of it felt like scenery in a play I no longer had a reason to perform in. My daughter Simone was 34 at the time. She'd married a man named Curtis 4 years earlier, a financial advisor who wore expensive watches and talked about the market the way some men talk about football. He had opinions about everything and expertise in nothing, but he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything that actually mattered. I didn't dislike him. I just never fully trusted the way he looked at things he wanted. After Carolyn passed, Simone called me every few days. She was worried about me rattling around in the house alone, she said. She wanted me closer. She said she and Curtis had been talking, and they had an idea. They lived in a suburb outside of Nashville, a nice enough area, growing fast, good schools. There was a property nearby that had just come on the market. A large craftsman-style home on 2 acres, 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch. They thought we could all live together. Simone would be close to keep an eye on me. I'd have company. Their daughter, my granddaughter Poppy, who was 4 at the time, would grow up with her grandfather down the hall. I want to be honest about my state of mind when I agreed to this. I was grieving. I was 65 years old, and for the first time in 4 decades, I had no one to come home to. When your children offer you family, you say yes. You don't run the numbers. You don't hire a lawyer. You say yes. The property was listed at $2.6 million. I offered 2/10 in cash to beat out a competing bid and close in 3 weeks. The deed went through my holding company, a quiet LLC I'd used for real estate purchases for years. I hadn't made a specific decision to keep it that way. It was just how I handled property. I never thought about it again. I moved into the guest suite on the main floor. It had its own bathroom, a good window facing the backyard, and enough space for my reading chair and the small bookshelf, where Carolyn's photograph sat on the second shelf from the top. I told myself, this was a new chapter. I told myself Carolyn would have wanted this. I'm going to tell you that the first year was fine. Not warm, not the family life I had imagined, but fine. No, Simone and I had dinner together, 3 or 4 nights a week. I took Poppy to the park on Saturday mornings. Curtis was civil. He traveled a lot for work, which made things easier. When he was home, he occupied a kind of parallel universe, present in the house but not really part of it. The second year, things started to shift. It began with small things. The way Simone started closing the kitchen before I could offer to help clean up. The way Curtis began responding to my questions at dinner with short answers, his eyes already drifting back to his phone. The way Poppy started spending more time in her room when I knocked on her door. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that middle-aged people get busy. I told myself I was being sensitive because I was lonely and old, and I'd lost my wife and I needed to stop making everything about myself. Then one Thursday night in January I couldn't sleep. I'd had a dry cough for a week, and it woke me up a little after midnight. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and a spoonful of honey, the way Carolyn used to make me take it. The house was dark. I could see the blue glow of the television coming from down the hall. from the sitting room that connected to the master suite. I assumed Simone had fallen asleep with the TV on. I filled my glass at the sink and started back toward my room. That's when I heard her voice. From the sitting room, low and tense. She was on the phone. I want to be clear that I didn't intend to listen. I stopped because I heard my name. When you hear your name spoken at midnight in a voice that sounds like that, you stop. I stood in the dark hallway, and I heard my daughter tell whoever was on the other end of that call that she was exhausted, that having me in the house had completely changed the dynamic, that Curtis was at his wits' end, that I was underfoot every single day, that I had no sense of personal boundaries, that I made her feel like she was being watched. She said, and I remember this with the kind of clarity that only comes with pain. She said, "He doesn't contribute anything, Kevin. He just takes up space. He eats our food, uses our utilities, and then acts like he's doing us a favor by being here." Kevin, her older brother, my son, calling after midnight to hear his sister vent about me. She kept going. She said Curtis had been talking about putting me somewhere, a retirement community. Nothing fancy, just something appropriate for his age and his situation, she said, as if I were a piece of furniture that needed to be stored in a climate-controlled unit. She said they couldn't exactly force me out since I paid for the place, but they'd been researching whether there were legal options. Curtis had spoken to someone at his firm about it. Legal options. I stood in the dark hallway of the house I had purchased for $2.8 million and listened to my daughter describe me as a problem to be solved. I didn't make a sound. I walked back to my room, closed the door without a click, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. I looked at the photograph of Carolyn on the bookshelf. She would have said something sharp and true, something I didn't want to hear but needed to. She always could. I just sat with the quiet for a long time. The next morning I came to breakfast like nothing had happened. I made coffee. I asked Simone how she slept. I told Curtis his presentation the week before had sounded interesting, the one he'd mentioned at dinner. I watched their faces for the relief that comes when someone doesn't know what you know. I saw it. They had no idea. And I began paying attention in a different way. I started noticing the finances. Not in an invasive way. I wasn't going through their files. But I had eyes, and the picture they were painting didn't add up. Curtis drove a car he'd leased 18 months ago that I knew cost over $90,000. Simone had started receiving packages 2 and 3 times a week, boxes from brands I recognized as expensive. They had recently hired a second person for the house, a woman named Bet, who came 3 days a week to help with Poppy and with the cooking. I knew what that cost. Curtis's income was real. He earned well, but the spending had outpaced it, and I could see that plainly in the way Simone's posture changed when certain envelope-shaped mail sat on the counter too long. She would move those envelopes quickly, face down, before I could see the return addresses. I said nothing. I just watched. About 3 weeks after the phone call, Curtis came to find me in the backyard on a Sunday afternoon. I was pulling up a section of dead sod near the fence that had been bothering me since autumn. He came out in pressed slacks, which struck me as an odd outfit for a backyard visit, and stood near the edge of the patio with his hands in his pockets. He said he was glad he caught me. Said he'd been meaning to have a conversation, man to man. Said he and Simone had been talking about the future, about making sure everyone in the family was protected. He sat down at the patio table and placed a folder on it, the kind with the brass prong fasteners, the kind lawyers use. He said he'd had a document prepared. A family trust arrangement, he called it. A way to streamline asset management and ensure that if anything happened to me, the transition of my estate would be handled smoothly and without the delays and costs that come with probate. He said it was something his firm recommended for people in my situation. Older, significant assets, no spouse. He said it would also give him and Simone the ability to help manage my finances on a day-to-day basis if I ever found that burdensome. I asked him if a lawyer had reviewed it. He said, of course, absolutely, his firm's legal team had looked it over. It was completely standard. I said I appreciated his thinking ahead, and I asked if I could take a few days to read through it with my own attorney. His face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. A door closing. He said there was actually some time sensitivity, something about annual trust formation deadlines, and tax your considerations. Language I recognized as technically plausible and fundamentally designed to create pressure. He said if we waited, we'd lose certain advantages, and he'd have to start the paperwork over in January. I said I understood, and I still needed my attorney to look at it first. He smiled the smile of a man who was recalculating. He picked up the folder, said of course, no rush, whatever made me comfortable. He went back inside. Through the kitchen window I watched him pull out his phone immediately. That evening, I called my attorney. Not Curtis's firm's legal team. Mine. A man named George Albright, who had handled the sale of my roofing business and who I trusted as completely as I trusted anyone left in this world. I drove to George's office 2 days later and placed the folder on his desk. I sat across from him and watched him read. I watched the shift in his expression, the way I'd watched Curtis's face at the patio table. When George looked up, he set his reading glasses on the desk and said, "Where did this come from?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he walked me through it, clause by clause, in the patient way he had. What Curtis had called a family trust arrangement was something considerably more aggressive. It transferred management authority over all liquid accounts, investment portfolios, and real property to the appointed co-trustee. Curtis, with limited oversight and broad discretionary powers. There were provisions that would have allowed him to make distributions to himself and Simone from my accounts, under the guise of administrative fees. There was a clause that could be triggered by a single medical professional's evaluation of my cognitive function, after which Curtis would assume full and irrevocable control. It was, George said carefully, a document designed to take everything I had. I asked him what he could tell me about their finances. He said he'd need a few days, but he knew people who knew people, and he'd make some calls. 4 days later, George called me back. Curtis's financial planning practice was under review by FINRA, the federal regulatory body that oversees financial advisors. 2 of his clients had filed complaints in the past year, alleging that he had moved their funds into unsuitable high-risk investments without their knowledge or consent. His personal credit profile was badly overextended. There were 3 maxed-out credit cards, a home equity loan on a home he didn't own, I noted, and 2 outstanding personal loans from a private lender. George estimated their total debt at somewhere north of $340,000, not counting the ongoing leases. Curtis wasn't a rising professional hitting a rough patch. Curtis was a man who had been borrowing against a future he couldn't guarantee and was now running out of places to borrow from. My money wasn't an opportunity to them, it was a life raft. I sat with that for a full day before I did anything else. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name. It's not the grief of losing someone to death. It's the grief of realizing who someone is. I had looked at Simone for 36 years as my daughter, as the little girl who used to drag her blanket into my workshop to watch me work, who cried at her mother's funeral with her whole body like a child, even though she was 33 years old. I had loved her without qualification, and she had stood in a sitting room at midnight and called me a man who takes up space. I made an appointment with George for the following Monday. I came prepared. The first thing I did was remove myself as a named individual from all personal bank accounts and consolidate my liquid assets, retirement accounts, investment portfolio, cash reserves, into an irrevocable trust managed by a professional fiduciary George had worked with for over a decade. The trust was airtight. Curtis's document would be useless against it. There was nothing left for his co-trustee clause to reach. The second thing I did was pull the deed on the Nashville property. As I'd known all along, the house was not in Simone's name. It was not in Curtis's name. It was titled to my LLC, the same holding company I'd used quietly for years. They had never asked. Curtis, who advised clients on financial planning for a living, had apparently never thought to verify who actually owned the roof over his head. He had assumed, and that assumption was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. George connected me with a commercial real estate group he worked with regularly. I told them I needed a fast close, cash buyer preferred, timeline prioritized over maximum return. They came back to me in 6 days with a developer who was assembling a larger parcel in the area and wanted the 2 acres. The offer was $2.75 million. I accepted. Closing was scheduled for 4 weeks out. I went home and continued making breakfast. I want to tell you about Poppy, because she's the reason I didn't move faster. She was 6 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and she had no idea what was happening in the adult layers of her house. She knew I made good pancakes and that I could identify every bird at the feeder by sound, and that I would always have time to read to her, even when her mother said she was too busy. She didn't know her father was drowning in debt. She didn't know her mother had called her grandfather a burden in the dark. One afternoon in February, she climbed up onto the stool at the kitchen counter while I was washing up and said, "Grandpa, are you and Mommy in a fight?" I dried my hands. I sat on the stool next to her. I asked her what made her think that. She said Mommy got a funny look on her face sometimes when I walked into a room. A tight face. She said she didn't like the tight face. I told her there was nothing for her to worry about. I told her that grown-ups sometimes carry things that have nothing to do with the people around them. I told her she was loved more than she could possibly understand yet. She accepted that the way children accept things, quickly, completely, already moving on. She asked me if we could build a birdhouse for the yard. I said yes. We spent the following Saturday building it from a kit I'd ordered online. She held the pieces while I hammered. She painted it yellow with a red roof. We hung it on the fence post near the dead sod I'd been meaning to finish reseeding. That was the Saturday I decided that whatever else happened, Poppy would be taken care of. I called George that evening and instructed him to set up an education trust in her name, separate, protected, inaccessible to either of her parents as beneficiaries. Enough to cover private school through graduation and 4 years of college, fully funded. Whatever happened to Curtis and Simone, Poppy's future would be intact. George had it finalized within a week. The trustee was a community foundation with a board of independent directors. Not me, not her parents. Neutral, professional, permanent. Now I want to tell you about the dinner party. It was a Saturday in early March. Simone had been planning it for 3 weeks. 12 guests. A catered setup. Wines from a shop downtown that charged more per bottle than I used to spend on a week of groceries when I was starting out. It was the kind of event Curtis used in lieu of personality. He liked to host. It made him feel like the kind of man he was pretending to be. I was invited to attend, which I found interesting. They seated me at the far end of the table near Curtis's college friend, a loud man named Doug, who had opinions about real estate and sports in equal measure. I think they seated me there so I would be occupied, visible but contained. I ate my dinner. I answered Doug's questions about roofing with more enthusiasm than he expected. I drank 1 glass of red wine slowly, and I watched. Curtis was performing at the head of the table. He had a story going about a client portfolio he'd grown 40% in a year, which I knew was either cherry-picked or fabricated, and his audience was eating it up. Simone moved around the table like a hostess in a magazine spread, refilling glasses, laughing at the right moments, projecting a life that existed almost entirely in appearance. Toward the end of the evening, after the dessert had been cleared and the wine had loosened everyone up, Curtis made a toast. He thanked his guests for coming. He talked about the importance of family and stability. He gestured toward me at the far end of the table and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "And of course we're grateful to have Simone's father with us. It's not always easy, getting older, losing that sense of independence. We're glad he has a place here where we can keep an eye on things." There was a murmur of sympathetic agreement around the table. I smiled. I raised my glass. I said, "That's very kind, Curtis," and I made my decision. The following Monday, George filed the closing documents. The sale was formally recorded. The developer had their parcel. My LLC had $2.75 million in a wire I watched hit the account from George's office at 9:30 in the morning. At 11, a process server drove to the house. Simone was home. Curtis was at his office. I know this because I was watching the security camera feed from my phone in the parking lot of a hardware store 2 miles away, the same camera system I'd had installed when we first moved in, the account for which was in my name, the login for which only I had ever needed. I watched her open the door. I watched her take the envelope. I watched her read the first paragraph, the one that identifies the legal owner of the property and informs the current occupants of the change in ownership and the requirement to vacate within 30 days. I watched her sit down on the porch steps. She called me immediately. I let it ring. She called Curtis. I could see her voice going from confused to frantic to something I didn't have a word for. After about 10 minutes, she went back inside. I drove back to the house. She was standing in the kitchen when I came through the side door, still holding the envelope. Her face completely changed from the composed hostess of 4 days ago. Curtis had apparently told her he was on his way. She looked at me the way people look at something they thought they understood and suddenly don't. Dad. Her voice was tight. Careful. What is this? I set my keys on the counter. I poured a glass of water, I said. It's a notice of sale, Simone. The property sold Monday morning. That's not possible. This is our house. It's my LLC's house, I said. Has been since I purchased it. The deed is a matter of public record if you'd like to verify. She put the envelope down on the counter. Her hands were shaking. You can't do this. Where are we supposed to go? Where is Poppy supposed to go? Poppy, I said, has an education trust in her name that will see her through college. I set it up last month. She's taken care of. Simone stared at me. Dad, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking where we're going to live. I know what you're asking, I said. The trust sale will take 30 days to finalize. That gives you a month to make arrangements. George can answer any procedural questions. She came around the counter. She stopped about 3 feet from me. Her voice broke open in a way I hadn't heard since her mother's funeral. I don't understand. Why are you doing this to us? We opened our home to you. We took care of you. You can't just... I heard the phone call, I said. She stopped. January, after midnight. You were talking to Kevin. You told him I was underfoot, that I didn't contribute anything, that I took up space. I kept my voice even. And then Curtis brought me a document that would have given him full legal control over everything I own. You knew about that document, Simone. I know you did. She didn't deny it. That was the part that cost me the most. Not her anger, not her tears, but the fact that she didn't deny it. Curtis arrived 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes, the expensive watch catching the kitchen light. He came through the door with the forward momentum of a man who intended to manage the situation, and then he saw my face and slowed down. He tried several approaches in the space of about 10 minutes. Concern. This was a misunderstanding. He had only been trying to protect the family. Negotiation. Could we revisit the arrangement, find something that worked for everyone? Veiled threat. He knew people. He had a lawyer. He wasn't sure I understood the legal complexity of what I'd done. I let him finish. Then I told him what I knew. The FINRA complaints, the personal loans, the credit cards. I told him I knew exactly what the trust document was designed to do, and I told him I knew it hadn't been drawn up by some impartial legal team concerned with my well-being. I told him the house was sold, the trust was locked, and Poppy's education account was protected by an independent board he would never have access to. He went very still. I told him that George had also been in contact with the appropriate regulatory office regarding the FINRA matters, and that if his former clients had been harmed in the ways the complaints alleged, the investigation would proceed with or without my involvement. He sat down. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. It was more like the feeling at the end of a long job, when the last section of roof goes down and you stand back and the thing is done and solid, and the weather can come now. Not triumphant. Just finished. I moved out the following week. I'd already arranged a rental in a quiet part of Brentwood, a small house with a good porch and a yard I could do something with when the weather warmed up. George had found me a temporary situation while I decided what I actually wanted long-term. I took my reading chair, Carolyn's photograph, and the birdhouse Poppy and I had built. She'd asked me to take it the week before, when I'd told her that I was going to be moving somewhere new. She said it was mine because I'd done most of the hammering. I told her she'd done most of the painting. She said we could share it. I said that sounded right. I'm not going to tell you I don't miss her. I miss her every day. The FINRA investigation moved forward through the spring. 2 other clients had come forward. Curtis's license was suspended pending review. I don't know what happens next for him. That isn't mine to carry. Simone called me in April. It was a Sunday. I was on my porch with coffee and a book and the birdhouse, visible on the fence post I'd put up the first week, and a nuthatch had already found it, which would have delighted Poppy. Simone didn't start with an apology. She started with exhaustion, the flat, deflated voice of someone who had run out of angles. She said she didn't know how things had gotten to where they were. She said Curtis had changed, that the financial pressure had changed him, that she had let herself get pulled into something she hadn't meant to become. She said she was sorry for what she'd said on the phone that night. She said she'd known it was wrong when she was saying it. I listened. I told her I believed her, and that I didn't think she was a bad person. I told her I thought she was a person who had been frightened and had made a series of choices from that fear, and that the choices had compounded in a direction I couldn't follow her. I told her Poppy's trust was intact and would always be intact, and that whatever happened to her and Curtis, my granddaughter would know she had a grandfather who took care of her. She cried, not the performative kind, the kind you can't control. I told her I needed time, and that I would be in touch. I meant it. I didn't know how much time. I didn't know what the other side of it would look like, but I meant it. After we hung up, I sat with the quiet for a while. The nuthatch came back to the birdhouse, and a second one showed up, smaller, probably a mate. They worked their way around the feeder pegs in that jerky, purposeful way nuthatches have, like they know exactly what they're doing, and they're not particularly interested in your opinion about it. I poured a second cup of coffee, and I thought about Carolyn, who had built things with me for 34 years and never once questioned whether I was worth the work. I thought about the roofing business, the early years, the cold mornings and the sore hands, and the particular satisfaction of a job done right. I thought about Poppy at the kitchen counter, asking me if her mother had a tight face, and how she'd taken my answer at face value because she trusted me completely, and how I intended to remain someone worth that trust. I was 67 years old. I had my health and my coffee and my porch and a birdhouse built by 2 sets of hands, and the morning was coming in clear over the fence line, and the day was mine to do something useful with. That felt like enough. That felt like a beginning.